realize I have to do this more often with the different people. So anyway, so I see one difference is at least the Silicon Valley is all the benefit. I get that, but the East Coast we have the Boston's.
Hmm.
They have MIT and
Yep.
Harvard, all the good schools.
Yeah.
Maybe they have some money
Hmm.
because the New York City is right there,
Yep.
Oakland is right there as
Right.
well. I see that they're rather than facing the like Pacific Rim, they're facing Atlantic Ocean. Is one difference is all the war is happening in the like Pacific wars,
Yeah.
which cause conveniently locate to the West Coast is better for the armies and navies.
Yeah.
I see one difference is. So my question here is why Silicon Valley is a Silicon Valley, but Boston is not so much. What's your take on it?
My take,
Yes.
if you look at Boston and Route 128 as number two, number two ain't bad. I think the rest of the world would love to be number two. So I think the question that's being asked, and it's been asked a lot, there have been multiple comparisons of Route 128, Harvard, MIT versus Silicon Valley, Stanford, University of California. And of course, the numbers show that in terms of numbers of companies, tech companies, numbers of employees in the tech companies, numbers of, innovations and general impact, the shift by, I think, the 1970s, there had been a shift from leadership by Route 128 to leadership by Silicon Valley. My point is that the big picture is that both these places are in the United States. That's the most important thing to recognize, that this happened, both places happened in the world's wealthiest, world's most powerful country. And I don't think that's a coincidence. Looking at Silicon Valley, these other places around the world, a lot of them maybe aren't doing so well, and they think of this as a model to follow, and they think about the orchards and the humble beginnings, the garage, right? But the fact is that the orchard, the garage, was in maybe the wealthiest state in the United States. California was born rich with the gold rush, and it stayed rich, and that helped. San Francisco was rich, and that as I mentioned, some of the ways it helped Silicon Valley. So I would more look at the country than the different regions, and then go beyond that. And the West Coast is a good example that Silicon Valley is great. Los Angeles has done pretty darn well. San Diego has done pretty darn well. And Seattle's done pretty darn well. And so there's something about the West Coast, not just Silicon Valley, where the access to the Pacific Rim mattered. All these places have major technology-based universities, whether it's UC San Diego, Caltech in LA, Stanford and UC Berkeley in the Bay Area, and University of Washington up in Seattle. So it's, in that respect, yeah, I'm not going to say it was inevitable, but if you're looking at an already prepared environment, which is a big question about Silicon Valley, the environment, it's really nice if your environment has you on the verge of becoming the wealthiest nation on the earth and on the verge of becoming the most powerful nation on earth. And both matter in terms of the successful development of entrepreneurship in an entrepreneurial region.
Right. So since you mentioned it, the top of my head, usually many countries are focusing on, known for one city, entrepreneurial city, like usually metropolitan cities. But what you're saying is, like, look at all the LAs, not just the Silicon Valley, Boston's, LA's, even New York, or like Seattle. All these multiple cities are popping up in terms of entrepreneurship. I never thought about it, but makes sense. And as a country as a whole, like, it's a significant impacts to the entire world.
But you know, there's another issue that you raised. You're talking about these active governments
Right.
doing something. And my impression for the longest time was, well, and it still is to an extent, that it's nice when a government is trying to do something. Silicon Valley, and there was no government body that was trying to create a Silicon Valley, a tech region like Silicon Valley, not at the federal level, not at the state level, not even locally until 1991, joint venture Silicon Valley begins. And that was because there was a recession and they're trying to protect what they already have. So in that respect, it's organic. You know, there wasn't a government body trying to decree that this would happen. Whereas in some of these other places in the United States, they had different stories. For instance, Route 128. They were in a tough place in the 1920s and at the beginning of the Depression, when some of their major industry had gone south, like timber industry, North Carolina, and so on. So that led to a regional effort to sort of defend the turf, and one of the outgrowths of that was essentially the first, we call it venture capital firm now, but it was part of a regional economic effort, the likes of which wasn't really happening in California. They didn't really need it. And Research Triangle's even better example, because North Carolina ranked something like number 48 in terms of wealth per capita, as late as sometime mid-century. But they did have these major universities. They had Duke, and they had University of North Carolina, North Carolina State, and they took advantage of it. But since they didn't have the wealth, they couldn't develop it with entrepreneurship the way it happened in Silicon Valley and Route 128. Instead, they did the Southern approach. And the Southern approach has always been to attract branches of existing firms. Hit the road and convince them, we don't have labor unions, we've got cheap land, and we've got a very motivated population, come join us. And that was the Southern strategy, and it worked. And that's what Route 128 was about, with branches from IBM and from other tech companies. Also branches of federal laboratories went down there. So a different form of government activity. They didn't really start getting much entrepreneurship till the 90s, but it made it much better than it had been. And North Carolina is probably never going to be ranked so low in terms of wealth again. And a lot of it's because of Route 128. So anyway, the organic nature of the valley almost makes these other efforts look, well, they're just different, is what I would say. Yeah.
So going back to the Silicon Valley, I think one of the interesting research you did is a comparison between the UC, like California, like Berkeley, as a public state schools, and Stanford as a private school.
Right.
So can you tell us what you're finding and what your like a take on the rivalry between those two universities?
Yeah, that there are a couple things about that. One is that the state of California was pretty generous to the university system, and by 1950 it was just University of California and UCLA, and then later they added UC San Diego and several others. The faculty made more money, way more money than Stanford's faculty. Stanford did not have the sort of resources per capita for across the board that Cal did. And so what did they do? How could they attract faculty knowing that their faculty would be paid less than if they went up the road to UC Berkeley? And the answer was giving them time for consulting and encouraging them to do that. It was, on the one hand, a very entrepreneurial response by the university. On the other hand, I remember talking to one of the faculty members who was at Stanford in the mid-1950s, where they were not only encouraged to do this, they were expected to do it. That since they were paid less, if you really wanted to make money, and essentially it also became considered as part of your tenure, what you were doing, it was nerve-wracking. Cal professors could more focus on what they've been trained to do, and so it's a much calmer environment. But Stanford, they were doing a couple things, and that really dates back decades. At Stanford, there was always sort of these more opportunistic faculty, and the thing that grew out of that stayed at Stanford, even after they finally got money, big money, from the Ford Foundation in the 1950s, that allowed them to pay their faculty as much, if not more, than the other major universities, including Cal. But what lingered was the culture of entrepreneurship, entrepreneurial faculty, taking advantage, but also this whole notion of soft money. Soft money is where there's a faculty position, maybe with an office, with an email account, all these things that you think about, but without salary, where the faculty member is required to raise the money for their own salary. And you can see this at Stanford now. The folks who run these entrepreneurship courses, and many of them are on soft money. The university doesn't have to budget for their salaries. These people have to go and raise the money to remain active on the campus at Stanford. And so that whole notion of soft money is nothing new. The earliest example I saw of it was actually from the 1930s, and it goes back to Varian Associates, the Varian brothers. They were working with a Stanford professor, a scientist. He was on salary, but these two guys weren't. They were developing their technology for radar, essentially, and they were given lab space at Stanford, but not money. What they had to do was they ended up working with the company Sperry, the Sperry Gyroscope Company, and Sperry, it was through Sperry, it was a sort of a three-way deal between the company, what became the company didn't even exist until the 40s, but the inventors, the university, and the company, where they not only got lab space, but they actually got money, and the money came from this company. So essentially, these guys raised their salaries so that they had access to Stanford's laboratories to do what they needed to do. And that's, as far as I can tell, the beginning of soft money, which continues today at Stanford, more than most universities, I think.
So what about the university level? So you're talking about faculty salary level.
Mm-hmm.
University level probably, like you said, the state, California state, more generous to obviously state school compared to the private school. So was that also encourage the step forward to do more opportunistic behaviors?
Yeah, and it was sort of push and pull. That Stanford, knowing that they weren't getting what Cal did, and that they would have to raise money for it, sort of encouraged them to be very active about getting money. But the push came from foundations. That foundations like Carnegie, Rockefeller, and Ford, where the foundations began funding higher education in the first decade of the 20th century with the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching. And it didn't take long for the foundations to focus their money on private universities. The assumption was the states would pay for the public universities. Now, when it came to faculty's pensions, the Carnegie Foundation quickly learned that states couldn't be relied on, and so they pretty quickly included the state universities in these pension programs, and that became TIAA-CREF. But what stuck was, even if you look at what the Ford Foundation was doing in the 50s, their biggest grants were to private universities. University of Chicago, Harvard, Yale, Stanford, University of Pennsylvania, Columbia, not the University of California. Because, again, the assumption was state universities got their money from the states. So to get foundation money, again, you need to write grants. You need to be active. You need to be entrepreneurial.
Right.
So it was sort of the same type deal where, and ultimately, of course, public universities have gotten into the foundation game, especially with the National Science Foundation. But the private universities have had decades of this using these muscles, these entrepreneurial muscles, and Stanford probably more than any, because well, the other thing about Stanford and their need for money, it was in the original setup of the university that they were not charging tuition. So where are they getting money? They're not getting it from the state. They're not getting it from their students. They've got a huge endowment, but it's tied up in bonds that are illiquid, and so Stanford had to scramble.
I always thought about the role of this private foundations.
Mm-hmm.
So which I don't think many other countries actually has those.
Right.
Maybe it's a cultural thing, because we don't, like in Korea, for example, Samsung, a big corporation,
Mm-hmm.
they do have a foundation, but not, help out the university as we did in the U.S. So we they had this, but not as aggressive as what we had in the U.S. But that proves me thinking that university also, for example, Korean university always seeking to government money. So it's like it's a procedural thing, right? So it's documented, just do whatever you are. But when you go to the private foundation, they probably require some creative things. So as an applicant, we need to build some more competitive package and so on and so forth. So which is, I think, really interesting, and it makes sense to me, the power of the private foundation too. So that's just a quick take on it. So next question is, it looks like we only 2 questions left, but it's really awesome, and I like all the story. So looks like the Silicon Valley, as you said, so many factors are encountering together, not intentionally designed, but somehow in the right time, right place, location, technology, university, people, and money, and also rivalism is, I think, sort of the play a little bit. Many other cities across the world wants to create like the Silicon Valley. So based on what you learn, what you found, what you're finding, what you found, what are the recommendations to them, like other than the Silicon Valley or some other country who wants to build like at least one like pseudo or like similar to what Silicon Valley is?
Yeah. Well, first, my focus would be on the ecosystem. In other words, what's the supporting system that's going to help the entrepreneurs and their organizations succeed? That it's nice to have motivated individuals, but it's even more important to, I mean, you can look at the success of certain places versus other places, and the people in other places aren't necessarily stupid.
Right.
They're just, they don't have access to resources. I mean, Silicon Valley, they like, folks out there love to think of themselves as the best and the brightest and the most, the boldest and all that. They're not the most highly educated. The most highly educated region in the United States is Washington, D.C. It's not Silicon Valley. So it has to do with a support network that includes not just finance, but the legal support, the academic anchors. I say anchors, not just one, because people talk about Stanford, but at some point, since Stanford has such a small undergraduate population, there were actually more engineers in the Valley who were trained at San Jose State than at Stanford because of sheer numbers. And so then having the ability to create businesses out of this, that's where combination of the Stanford Business School, but also the University of California had a lot to do with this. That they, getting back to you'd asked about, Harvard, and well, yeah, Harvard was not a tech university. MIT is, and so if you want to look at one difference between Route 128 and Silicon Valley, you can look at the nature of the engineering schools. MIT, University of California, and Stanford, especially in these areas like electronics and computer science and so on, are ranked very high. Harvard less so. So it's almost as if there's twice the horsepower in Silicon Valley and in environs than in Route 128. But anyway, having this supporting system, and it gets to, I mentioned infrastructure, the airports, and financing. I mean, the venture capital scene in Silicon Valley is, head and shoulders above the rest of the world. And, whether they're local laboratories. I mean, I'll give you an example. My cousin went to Stanford University, got his MBA at Harvard, came back to Silicon Valley and worked for a ton of tech companies. He worked for Hewlett-Packard twice. He worked for ROM, which got acquired by IBM. He worked for Memorex. He worked for Raychem, another startup, local company. And so he ended up starting a couple of different businesses there, and was able to do it because there was money right there. And so, and you know the story about Facebook. Mark Zuckerberg comes out because of the money, essentially. But anyway, this whole infrastructure matters a whole lot.
So my last question is, we all talk about so far is all the major cities. So probably what you learned and what you found is help out to increase entrepreneurial capability in the rural area like Salisbury, and then so many cities across the world. They're not aiming to the Silicon Valley to become like a Silicon Valley, but they do want to increase their local economy by modeling like Silicon Valley.
Mm-hmm.
So do you have any recommendations and things they can consider to increase their local entrepreneurship ecosystem?
Well, I don't know the answer, but I have some thoughts. And my main thought has to do with before trying to be a Silicon Valley, I think what a region really needs to do is ask, how can it become the best version of itself? Rather than trying to be something different, what is it that region brings? And the region we're in is a pretty clear example. We're agricultural. We're also, Ocean City is the number 2 travel destination on the East Coast. I don't know how many million people come there every year. So we have tourism. We also have, people tend to retire where they recreate. So that's another industry. So what do you do when you've got people who recreate, who retire? Well, it's happening. No one set out for this to become a medical cluster here, but we're getting it anyway because this is what people need. And so that's one example of how some of it can be organic. I don't think, we do have people thinking about how this region should progress, but a lot of it just comes based on demand and what's coming anyhow. So I guess that's my main thought is in trying not to discount what you already have. So.
So my final words, ask for you is if you have any last words to the Korean students who study the entrepreneurship with the different environments. I know this is not on the list, but if there's anything you have for them, I think it's really great to have.
Well, obviously way more about the Korean situation than I do, and I do know that we've talked a little bit about how Terman, once he retired from Stanford as provost and had been the dean of engineering and the chair of electrical engineering and all that he then starts taking what he considers the Silicon Valley model elsewhere. He took it to New Jersey, trying to create a graduate university there. Didn't work. He took it to the Lehigh Valley, and with mixed results. Took it to Dallas, Texas, with mixed results. And actually, in Dallas, Texas, he was working there with them the day that President Kennedy was assassinated. And in fact, Kennedy's remarks that he never got to give specifically mention what the technical possibilities were in Dallas that were sort of envisioned by Terman and others. But then Korea was another place where Terman visited. I don't know how it went, and I don't know the extent to which this has become becoming a best version of what was already going to happen there, or it just represented something utterly new. You would have to tell me that, and I'd like to learn it.